On September 10th, late in the afternoon, I boarded an airplane, flew to San Francisco, met my superior there, and then we got on another airplane and flew down to Los Angeles. Went to bed rather late. Next morning, got up early, 5 o'clock. My office called me shortly after that, said, "Turn on the television." And I did, and I saw most of it live. I saw most of it as it happened. It was interesting because that late afternoon and evening before, my superior and I had some rare moments together. He's a wonderful man. I love him very much. He's like a spiritual father to me. He had been in World War II. He was part of that greatest generation, as it's been called, my dad's generation. He'd been in World War II. He was one of the first Navy SEALs. He and 99 other hand-picked men went in first at Normandy. They blew up the mines to make way for the invasion force. 95 of the 100 were killed outright. And Father Jim was one of the ones who lived, one of 5 who lived. And he told me about it, and we talked about his experiences during World War II. He rarely does that. And then, of course, the next day, early in the morning, the events of September 11th unfolded. We watched it together in living color, in amazement. But I have to say that although I was amazed and shocked and horrified, I wasn't surprised. Then I went and celebrated my father's funeral. For I buried my dad on September 11th. When I walked into the chapel, I hadn't been there before. I flew in for the funeral. I had been preaching in Buffalo. Actually, they notified me when I finished preaching on Friday night in Buffalo, New York. They told me that my dad had died, and so I flew in as soon as I could. And I got there just in time to do the funeral. And when I walked to the chapel, I was struck by something. There, my dad's casket, and on the casket were 2 symbols. An American flag, for my dad was a veteran. He'd been in the Navy in World War II. And a crucifix. An American flag and a crucifix. And immediately the thought came to me that my dad was a real veteran. He had fought in not 1 but 2 wars, and he had served not 1 country but 2. In his early years, when he was in his late teens and early 20s, of course, World War II came along, and like almost all of the men of his generation, he went in service. He went off to the South Pacific. My grandfather had been in the Army in World War I. Dad, Navy, World War II. Some of his younger brothers, Korea, my generation. I went enlisted in the Army during Vietnam conflict. But those 2 symbols struck me. The American flag and the crucifix. Yes, when he was a young man, my dad fought in the war. And when he was an old man, he fought in another kind of a war. I'll never forget, I know the moment it really began. It was shortly after I was ordained a priest. My dad had come down to Florida to hear me preach for the first time. And in the morning after a long night of preaching and hearing confessions, he said to me, "Hey, son, you got a minute for your old man?" And I said, "Sure, Dad." And my father said, I'd like to go to confession. And I had the rare experience of hearing these words come out of my father's mouth. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's 50 years since my last confession. And then my dad made a beautiful confession, and a few minutes later, after he said, "You know, I wish I could have been a better father." And I know that God, our Father, heard that aspiration of my dad's heart as a prayer. And that's when the war, the second war, began for my father. Because you see, from that moment on, he entered into redemptive suffering. And for the next 7 years or so, he knew nothing but suffering. The cross. Over 30 surgeries. 3 open heart surgeries, surgeries on his spine, surgeries on his eyes, surgeries on his hands. At times he was in so much pain he couldn't lie down in a bed to sleep the last year or 2 years of his life. He had to sit up in a chair. My father had served 2 countries, and my father fought in 2 wars. We have a new kind of war. But then again, there's an old kind of war. We've got a new war now, and we've got an ancient war. And that old war, that ancient war, that primordial war, that war precedes, that war underlies, that war conditions, and that war determines the outcome of this new kind of war. Now, in case any of you are confused, at least with respect to what I think about what's been going on, I just want to tell you, now I've never suffered before, I don't think, from ambiguity. Most of you who know me wouldn't say that I have a problem with being too subtle or not expressing myself clearly. This new kind of war, oh, it's a very real war. And it is, in fact, a war between good and evil. There isn't any question about that. Now, some people are confused about that. I don't think a lot of people, but some people are. I gave this particular talk that I'm doing now in the first version of it about 3 days after September 11th. Okay, Friday night. It's the first time. The next Friday. I was on an airplane 2 days after that. It was a 757 with 8 people on it. That's a rare distinction. Not too many people have flown on that jumbo a jet with 8 passengers. I was one of the 8. That night, a lady stopped me and said, "But we're evil too." How do you respond to that? There's a difference. The country that I grew up in as a boy was the greatest country on the face of the earth. 18 years later, when I enlisted in the Army, I still believe my country was the greatest country on the face of the earth. And now, many years later, and a lot of perhaps unfortunate things, bad laws and so forth, I still say we're not perfect, but this is the greatest country on the face of the earth. You may... Now, you and I, we may have had our doubts about the moral fabric of this country. Let's face it, from when you and I were younger to the present time, boy, a lot has happened, and not all for the better. You and I know that. We have seen such horrors as abortion, elevated and given the dignity of a law. Now, law is a noble thing. Taking of the life of the innocent is not a noble thing. It's a great evil. It is something that has torn and weakened the very moral fabric of this great nation. We have seen the once wholesome environment that was part and parcel of this great country eroded away. When I was a boy, now just I'm 54 years old. When I was a young boy, there was television, more or less just beginning. But anything you turned on was pretty decent, right? I mean, they were real careful, weren't they, what they put on the television. Even the movies, they were pretty careful not to offend the moral sensibilities of a basically moral nation. And then over the years, under the specious pretext of freedom, which is not at all freedom but rather license, we became desensitized to what is wholesome and good. And so we saw our country slip morally. I have never denied those things. I have never tried to look the other way and say, oh, my country's perfect. No. We're not perfect. But we are still the greatest nation on the face of the earth. No one, and I mean no one, even comes close when it comes to charitable works. Can you imagine for a moment any other country doing what we have done for so many nations? All right, we're not perfect. Okay. We've got to set about to straighten things out. I know that. You know that. But I just want to let you know, in case you weren't sure, exactly where I'm coming from. I have always been an American. I have always been proud to be an American. I come from a long line of Americans. Every generation, all the way back, served in the armed forces. We were all patriots. Patriotism is not a bad thing. Patriotism is a virtue. America's a great country. Those who love their country need now to be more vigilant than ever. We have to work very hard, for we indeed have a new kind of war. But you've got to remember that underlying that new kind of war, there's an old kind of war, a very ancient war. A war between good and evil, a war between truth and lies, a war between light and darkness, a war between the forces of life and the forces of death. Oh, every so often in the course of human events, throughout history, every now and then, that battle that goes on in the unseen realms, the spiritual realm, that flames up and bursts through the veil, separating the seen from the unseen. And so it is now. We have seen this explosion of evil. When I got on the airplane on Monday in San Francisco, we wouldn't let children pray in school. On Tuesday, you couldn't find a school where they weren't praying. On Monday, people were protesting if you prayed or talked about religion, saying their civil liberties were somehow violated. On Tuesday, the same people were huddled together in prayer. No atheists in foxholes.